So first, a quick look at the agenda. Like I said, I will give you a brief introduction to the project. And then Federica Pozzi from ECOS, which stands for the Environmental Coalition on Standards, will provide a bit of more interview of the project as a whole, but also the role of green public procurement and the discussions in a European setting. After that, I'm happy to welcome Fiona Skinner, who works at Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative at Undido. And she will give us a global outlook on these issues. And then Susanna Toller from the Swedish Transport Administration will talk about their experiences of working with climate procurement requirements in the infrastructure sector. And Jens Johansson from the National Agency for Public Procurement will briefly describe an initiative where they have looked into how to work with the climate requirements in public procurement. And this round will end with Stefan Uppenberg at WSP, who's been working with these issues for a long time, both in a Swedish context, but also in international studies looking at experiences from around the world. So I'm thinking pretty short intervention, around 10 minutes or so. I guess we could follow up with a couple of questions after each of the interventions, and then hopefully we'll have some time in the end to go around the table for discussions and questions. So any questions before we jump into it? No. So like I said, this meeting today is part of a project which is led by ECOS, and the focus is on ways to decarbonize cement and concrete by trying to push both the policies on the European level and in the individual member states in the European Union. So on the EU level, focus has been on, for example, the EPBD, the CPR, and ESPR, but also on cement and concrete standards and opening up standards for alternative cement and concretes, which could open up for clinker substitution and alternative binders and also clean energy supply. And apart from, we are, IVL is the Swedish partner in this project, but there are also national partners in Belgium, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, and Denmark. So that's a brief overview. And with that, I leave the word to you, Federica.
Great. Thank you very much, Johan, for the short introduction. It was very on point. I will now share my screen 1 second. I prepared a short presentation that mainly focuses on the European context, because that's where we are most active at the moment, and you should be seeing my presentation. Okay, that's but maybe before starting, a few words about ECOS. So ECOS is the Environmental Coalition on Standards, and it was just presented. We are an international environmental NGO with about 54 members in Europe and internationally. As our name said a bit, we work in the European standardization system, so we are one of the 4 civil society organizations that work in this, let's say, very specific context where European standards are designed and developed in support of policies. I work in our buildings and industry team, and our effort is supported by the technical input of about 15 experts that help us with the development of standards and with the more technical policies that we're involved in. I've just put here on a slide just to frame a bit the context of where we're starting at. I mean, this webinar is focused on cement and concrete, but I think the numbers that you see here on the screen are a bit telling of, of all construction products in general, starting from embodied carbon with quite significant numbers in terms of CO2 footprints. But I think that the discourse, especially on green public procurement, should not stop there. There's other environmental indicators that are quite significant of the environmental and climate impact of cement and concrete, but of all construction products in terms of raw materials used in their production, which is about half of all raw material consumed in the EU. In terms of water, fresh water use, that is also a third of all water used in the EU. And in terms of waste generation, I mean, at the moment, construction products, and in particular cement and concrete, are not specifically circular products and what we call. So I think there's a lot to do there. And indeed, green public procurement is one of those instruments that is really a chance to transform the construction sectors. And yeah, I'm happy to be here today to, exchange with you about this very important topic. To us, what's important is that those criteria will be mandatory and continuously updated. The idea is to give businesses predictable signs to drive innovation, well, to compete on the internal market and to decarbonize indeed. The idea is that, as I will present in a second, that green public procurement within European legislation will be indexed to eco-design and those criteria that will focus on better designing products and, also assemble them into a building in the end. So it's important that those rules that will be, created will push up the market and help those also lower carbon business to find a bigger audience that is indeed the case at the moment. I wanted to start a bit from the state of the art across the different member states. I think you're a bit all aware that there's not one approach at EU level. So there is indeed the rather fragmented approach with different levels of ambition and with different level of authorities regulating green public procurement for construction. In certain member states, it's the cities, in others it's the regions, in others it's a national level approach. For example, that's the case of Italy, with very differing level of ambitions. Some member states tackle different type of products, and indeed the definition of green is not something that is the same across different procurement policies. So the question that are a bit, I think, open now at the European level are, well, the 3 that you see over here on the screen. So what's a green construction product? So what's a green cement and concrete? How do I measure what's green? And what are the priority products to tackle? Are cement and concrete indeed the priority products because they have a large market and because they carry the, let's say, the heaviest environmental impact? So those are all questions that are at the moment very much discussed at European level, and that's maybe something that it's interesting to discuss here today with you as well. So what's happening at European level at the moment is that, as we have said, there's not a common approach at the product level. We have building level criteria for green public procurement that I think they have just been finalized. So in the past, I think, year and a half, we work on the development of those criteria, but those criteria remain voluntary. So they're not a mandatory approach in having criteria used by all public authority across the EU. So that means that certain authority can decide to use them, but they're not obliged to do so. But I think a lot is happening, on the other hand, at the product level, so at the level of construction products, so mainly for cement and concrete. Because on the 30th of March of, well, what's now last year, the Commission has proposed first the circular economy package, where the revision of the construction products regulation is included. And within this updated framework, where, well, maybe a few words of what the construction products regulation is. It's the main legal framework for the placement on the market, so the marketing and the internal market for construction products, which now has, let's say, an extended scope that also looks at, well, the environmental impacts of construction products. It's a file that is now being discussed, so it's what is now we call in co-decision with the institutions here in Brussels. And this piece of regulation now includes a new chapter on member state incentives and one article on green public procurement, which is indeed a positive step forward. Yet we will see in the next few slides that it's something that it's highly debated, and not all parties to the debate are in favor of maintaining and strengthening this this policy. In this article also we find some high-level parameters, and I have to say that the most of them relate to cost efficiency. So at the moment, also, let's say, the comparison between different, let's say, concrete types will not be based on the environmental impacts, but mainly based on cost efficiency, which is something that we would also see a bit changing in a more sustainable direction. And here a few words about how the approach of the CPR is in relation to green public procurement. So basically, what the CPR foresees is that what will be considered greens are the top two classes of performance that will be identified according to different parameters. I put here on the right, well, that's an energy label, so does not relate at all to construction products. But what we foresee is the development of classes of performance for each environmental indicator. So, for example, if we will speak about embodied carbon in products, what we expect is that for every product category, there will be secondary legislation or standards that will identify and somewhat categorize different product types in a product category according to their product performance in relation to embodied carbon, for instance. And that would mean that at one point there will be a sort of thresholds, let's say here above the C, where certain products will be considered greens, and those are the products that will be available on the market for green public procurement from procurement authority across member states. Yet this approach would mean that those criteria would be mandatory, meaning that only if a public authority decides to procure green, then the authority will have to use those criteria, but it will not imply that all procurement projects, let's say from infrastructure to, I don't know, government buildings, will have to use those criteria. So there will still have to be somewhat of work more at the local level to ensure that implementation happens and that a public authority decides to procure green. So that's something to keep in mind. And here a bit in slides on the risks. I think we have identified the three levels of risks: political, technical, and implementation. As I said, that is somewhat related to the political level. We find that there is strong opposition from a few political parties and a few member states, and including the industry, which is something that we were not really expecting, because we see public procurement really as an instrument to support industry towards the green transition. So that's something. We have some let's say, some high-level politicians that are proposing to completely delete the mention of green public procurement from the text. So it's something that will need support and information, provided on why it's really key for the sector. And then there's two questions related to the technical level. So it will be essential to understand what green means, meaning that there will be a lot of technical work put into understanding what's feasible thresholds on the European internal market that will identify those green products without creating, unfair competition among different, for example, cement and concrete types. Also a question of how do we aggregate different environmental indicators in one performance classes, like one kind of, one energy and one performance label like this. So what does it mean to be green? Does it mean to be low in embodied carbon, circular, reusable, toxic free? So and there's a series of environmental indicators that are proposed by the legislation, and it will be interesting, but also I imagine conflicts to see how this will play out altogether. And then a last slide on what's the best case scenario. So at the moment, this article on green public procurement does not foresee any target or any date for the development of those criteria. We are proposing, and we have seen that it's a proposal that has been taken up by a few political parties and member states on setting a date for 2025. So from 2025, the Commission should come out already with what we call secondary legislation, delegated act, on those mandatory common EU level criteria. We also hope to see a structured approach to this. So we hope to see that the Commission and in the CPR, there would be a working plan with the prioritization of products. And for us, that would be mainly on cement, concrete, and steel, because for us, indeed, those are the products that are the most procured in large quantities on the internal market for example, for big infrastructural projects. So we think that that is something that should be indeed included. And then, as I said at the very beginning, we hope to see that cost effectiveness is not the only parameters that is let's say, used to decide on, what to procure, but that, of course, the environmental impacts more generally are considered at the same level of the concept of cost effectiveness. And that's all from my end. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions if you have any.
Thank you, Federica. Any questions now? Fiona?
Thank you, Federica, for the interesting presentation. I had a question on the sort of the performance labeling and whether there has been any discussion on the ramping of the sort of performance labeling. So once it's established, as the market evolves, in what frequency that labeling would have to be, for example, updated as the performance of the products on the market improves?
Yeah, that's also a very complex question. I think that we are not there yet with discussion, but the construction products regulation fits into a more general framework, which is the one of eco-design for all products. So the idea is that the EU wants to make all products on the EU market sustainable. So this type of label is already used for energy-related products, so for your washing machine and fridges. And the rule usually is every 5 years this label is updated. But I mean, that's something that, of course, construction products are always considered with special rules in the EU. So it's something that will have to be further negotiated once those instruments are more developed, and so it's something a bit more for the future, but yeah, something good to keep in mind.
Right. So let's move over to Fiona then.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So very nice to meet you all. My name is Fiona Skinner. I coordinate the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative, also known as the IDDI. The IDDI is an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial and housed within Undido as its secretariat. It's really a coalition of governments working with the private sector, academia, and think tanks to support and drive the decarbonization of heavy industries, starting with steel, cement, and concrete. So we now have 9 country members, most recently Japan and Sweden, whose membership was announced at COP28 a few months ago. We are also, of course, aspiring and actively working to grow this membership and country commitments to green public procurement. So other members of our initiative include the UK, India, Canada, Germany, the UAE, the US, and as I said, we are looking to grow our membership this year. So we know that decarbonization of heavy industry and of the construction sector is a big challenge, but the key point that I want to emphasize is that the decarbonization of hard or possible to abate sectors isn't simply a matter of energy efficiency or fuel switching, but it's really a fundamental transformation of our energy systems. And we're creating new value chains and lead markets for what we need to really clearly define low carbon construction products. So to create these markets, we're working to build the foundations to enable their creation. So we've identified some key gaps to be filled. And one of the challenges here that we need to address relates to the availability of data on embodied carbon and the improvement of reporting and sharing structures throughout the entire value chain, from primary manufacturers all the way to public and private buyers. So we know that the current reporting and data standard systems used internationally don't capture all that's required to sort of accurately evaluate embodied carbon along the supply chain. And that is something that we are looking to address. So the other gap is the development of clear definitions at the product level, just as Federica mentioned as well, and related to that sort of robust and harmonized standards for low or near zero emission steel, cement, and concrete to support that market for low carbon products and to ensure common language for communicating on these global commodities and also a level playing field. Our role as a UN agency is to use our convening capacity to bring coherence and convergence on these definitions and standards as much as possible. The other gap is green public procurement policy, and that is with a view to help create demand and lead markets for the private sector to invest in clean energy technologies, including hydrogen, CCUS, and others. And beyond creating an enabling environment, the other pillar of this work really is political will. So getting countries to collaborate across geographies to agree on procurement commitments. So this brings me to our Green Public Procurement Pledge, which was announced last year at September's Clean Energy Ministerial. And in this pledge, we have 4 ambition levels to which signatories, which can be national governments or subnational governments, can commit to. So we believe this pledge is a very powerful tool because green public procurement accounts for a huge portion of the steel and cement that's procured globally. Government agencies are top purchasers of steel, cement, and concrete for infrastructure projects. And in total, we estimate that the public consumption of steel and cement in the countries signed up to the IDDI accounts for anywhere between 25 to 40% of the domestic market. So using government purchasing power to switch to low carbon steel and cement would really send vital signals to encourage the levels of investment required to create a thriving low carbon market. Essentially, if we see governments committing to that target, that's a huge signal for the private sector to bring in investment needed for these projects. So looking at this pledge, levels 1 and 2 speak to requirements for disclosure of embodied carbon through EPDs or comparable independently verified reports, and the requirement to conduct whole project lifecycle assessments. So this is all about getting to know the baseline. Where do we stand? Getting the numbers right so that we can understand where signatories are and use this data to support the development and the implementation of markets. It also asks signatories to commit to aligning all levels of policy to make sure that climate policy speaks to energy policy, speaks to what is happening in procurement policy as well. Levels 3 and 4 are more focused on specific procurement targets by signatories for public construction projects to create that demand pull for low and near zero emissions steel and cement. So level 3 requires procurement of low emissions cement, concrete, and steel in public construction projects, applying the highest level of ambition possible under national circumstances. So this is about the creating demand for existing decarbonization technologies that still need to be deployed more widely. Level 4 requires the procurement of a share of cement or crude steel from near zero emissions material production for signature projects. So this is really about creating demand for those breakthrough technologies that are, sort of very early in their development and really need that demand pull to get that wider deployment. So this pledge was developed in consultation with our member countries, as well as 3 IDDI technical working groups, which met on a monthly basis over the course of 2022. And in September, 3 governments, the UK, Canada, and Germany, committed to holding national consultations on this pledge. So as of last November, last September, sorry, they now have 1 year to decide on the level of ambition that they can commit to, and then we'll move to implementation of this pledge. So at the moment, I can't speak in too much details where we are in each of those countries because it is an ongoing process, but some of the key challenges that we face and continue to face are in the design of the pledge were, of course, what is the appropriate level of ambition? How to set a target for 2030 that will get us to net zero by 2050 that's both ambitious enough, but also achievable for our countries. And then secondly, to echo something Federica mentioned as well, is the diffuse nature of procurement. So in most countries, there's no central procurement agency that's solely responsible for procurement policy. So what that means is that there were, and we continue to hold a lot of conversations and discussions and alignments to ensure that we're, speaking to the appropriate decision makers. Patience and negotiation has really been key to ensure that we have more countries joining and committing to this pledge. And then the key challenge, which will be the focus of our work in 2023, is how to move from a high-level policy commitment to sort of actual implementation on a country level. And so we are designing our work plan for this year to really support the countries in really implementing this pledge. So that's where I'll stop for now, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Fiona. Questions? So I have a question on. So there's by now there's lots of these initiatives. There's this first mover coalition and several others, especially when it comes to steel. But I think some of them apply to cement and concrete as well. So what's your view of that? Is that just a good thing, or is it a challenge, you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question we get a lot, and it's a fair question. I think, especially for those who are not inside the initiatives, the landscape can be very confusing. Frankly, with the First Movers Coalition, there are things like Steel Zero and Concrete Zero as well. And those are actually very complementary to the work that we are doing, because we are seeking to get public sector commitments, while the FMC, Steel Zero, Concrete Zero, they're all seeking to get private sector commitments. So together, we're actually very complementary, and we're covering commitments from the whole market. On the standard side as well, there are a lot of initiatives cropping up. And as I said before, we really see as a UN agency, we're able to get sort of bring consensus across countries, country-driven consensus and a very broad-based sort of audience to bring together in a convening capacity. So that's really where we see our role. And so we're really hoping to drive that harmonization on a higher level. I don't think that there will be a situation where we have one golden approach that works for every country in the world, but I think we just need to make sure that the approaches that are taken are moving in the same direction rather than diverging.
So maybe both Fiona and Federica can speak to this, but was the European introduction of carbon border adjustment mechanism. Do you have any view on that? How does that play into all of this? Does it complicate things, you think, or?
I mean, it does. It definitely does. So trade issues are not the primary focus of our work in the IDDI, but of course, these are global commodities, and the discussion is sort of interlinked with everything we do, so it cannot be ignored. It's an issue that comes up very often in our discussions, particularly with countries, because yeah, I mean, any sort of procurement commitments we make have trade implications. I apologize if it's a bit difficult for you to hear me right now. There's some background noise, but we, for in the development of our Green Public Procurement Pledge, we were in close consultation with the WTO as well to ensure that any sort of commitments made on behalf of countries are not contradictory to contradictory to the spirit of any trade agreements. Specifically on the CBAM, it's we work a lot with developing countries at Undido as well, of course, and we are trying to gear our work towards more in-country engagement as well to ensure that there is a level playing field, that countries at the beginning of this decarbonization journey are making investments now that can allow them to compete globally going forward in the light of things like CBAM.
Susanna?
Yes, I have a question. I try to figure out how to phrase this in a good way. So I sometimes meet the question, why do you work with climate requirements in public procurement when we have this ETS system? Is this really a useful way of spending your resources from the authority? Could you please elaborate a little bit around that? Because what's the usefulness of using public procurement as a tool when we have these international regulations?
Maybe I can give it a go at this. Actually, maybe Fiona can go after. I think the EU ETS acts on the production level side and does not consider the whole life cycle of products. And that's, I think, what green public procurement can do, especially if it looks at indicators that go beyond embodied carbon or carbon footprint, for instance. But even at that level, there are, let's say, environmental impacts that go beyond, just the production level side. So I think then there are questions of whether the EU ETS has been effective or not. I think there are questions, especially at the level of cement plants, where free allocation is a bit, distorted the market as a bit. We will see now with the CBAM how that will play out. But I think all those questions kind of go into the direction of showing that there are other instruments that are, economic instruments that can be used by public authority to ensure that what they procure is effectively green. So not sure if that was clear. It's a bit of a complex question, as you said.
I think Jens would like to have a say.
Yes, thank you. Jens Johansson, the National Public Procurement Agency. I think perhaps your answer, you already answered them, but and if this is a complementary side note from me, I mean, if you produce different alternatives, then someone has to buy the alternatives that are actually better. And that that doesn't the market of the ETS, what you use this abbreviation ETS is does not sorry, it's hard to argue in English when I'm used to argue in this in Swedish, but sorry, I failed in this. Men på svenska, alltså om någon producerar något som är bättre på marknaden, de som producerar det som är sämre kan producera det för att de har köpt de här utsläppsrättigheterna. Men om ingen köper det som är bättre så kommer ju de gå ut, så kommer ju de få mindre marknadsandelar fastän de är bättre. Så att man köper ju ett avlatsbrev i den här utsläppshandeln. Men avlatsbrevet hjälper ju inte de som är bättre om ingen köper deras produkter. Det är ju bristen i det här systemet.
Good point.
Yes. Yeah, I think this goes into this ever-reaching debate between economists and other. I think, but that in the economic textbooks, carbon pricing is the first best policy instrument. So, but we all know that in the real world, we can't raise the carbon price at the technologies need to be in place before industry will accept high carbon prices. So I think most I don't know, people looking into this agrees that there needs to be a combination of policy instruments and policy sequencing. Not all economists agree, I think, and I think it's worth discussing because policies come at a cost, and we don't want to overdo things. But yeah, Fiona, you also had a raised hand, I think, but.
Yeah, I think I was just going to, I didn't understand what was being said in Swedish, but I think I will just echo what was said, hopefully, which is essentially that new technologies, they come with a green premium, and large investments are required on behalf of those developing those technologies. And so any sort of a guaranteed lead market that occurs through procurement commitments specifically, but also green public procurement more generally, will sort of create that pull for technology development. So that's my view.
So let's move on over to you, Susanna.
Okay, thanks for all the answers. I'm with you. We definitely think that the public procurement is part of the solution. I'm just gathering the arguments. So I was interesting to know what you would answer to that question. I will try to see if I can share. I'm not so used to Teams, Johan, so I will try this. I don't know if it's going to work. I'll do my best.
Yeah, it's working.
Do you see do you see a red page now?
Yeah, but
is it big enough?
Yeah, I guess it works. Well, what happens if you push this?
I have no idea what will happen. Do you want me to try that?
Presentation mode.
Yes, I try. I don't know if it.
Yeah.
Are you seeing the right screen still?
Yes.
Okay, good, perfect. I don't see your faces now, but never mind.
We're here.
Yeah. So I was asked to give you some examples from climate procurement requirements used in the infrastructure sector. So I will tell you about our experiences from the Swedish Transport Administration. But it didn't work very well to change slide. No, sorry, maybe it's a delay. Yeah, I want to take off from our goals. That is that the Swedish Transport Administration will have no greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. So it's an ambitious goal, and we have also sub-goals for the years to come. As you can see, I don't want to say too much about this. I want to tell you about the work that we do to reach those goals. and especially how we use the climate requirements in our public procurements. So we use climate requirements in 3 different ways, you could say. For the larger projects that we have, we ask for a decrease of greenhouse gas emissions compared to a baseline. And this is used as a contract clause. It's not used as evaluation criteria in the procurement. So the one who wins the bids needs to deliver something that is better than the baseline. A certain percentage is better than the baseline, and everything is calculated in an LCA tool that we have called Klimatkalkyl. So I think that is, Fiona, maybe your level 3 or something in what you showed us before. We do these LCA calculations for the whole project. This is used in the larger projects, those who cost more than 50 million Swedish crowns. And for the smaller projects, we do not do these LCA calculations by default. Instead, we ask for climate data on the specific materials that have shown to be of most importance in our project. That's cement and concrete, of course, but also steel and asphalt. And we also use climate requirements on fuels used in the production. And then the third type is when we procure ourselves some material that is technically approved material that is purchased by the Transport Administration, and then the projects are using this material that has already been purchased by the Transport Administration. So it's not purchased by the contractors. That's the difference. So these are like the 3 types of climate requirements we use in our procurements. And for the second 2 ones, then when we ask for the climate performance of specific materials, we use EPDs as verification document for the climate performance. It works quite well, we think. We ask for this standard EN 15804 as the rule for the calculations, to be sure that everyone calculates according to the same basic rules. And we get mostly positive response from our contractors and suppliers by doing so. They think that this way of asking for a climate performance of a material and asking for an EPD as a verificate, it's a fair, feasible, and predictable way of using climate requirements. It's also transparent. So and the EPDs that we receive then in our projects, we have a lot of projects we procure for about, it's more than 50 miljarder Swedish crowns every year. What's that? It's like
5 billion euros or something like that.
Yeah, 5 billion euros every year. So it's a lot of material, and a lot of projects that we procure every year. We receive a lot of EPDs then. Those are received and interpreted centrally at the Transport Administration, as we thought it was a little bit too hard for the different project leaders to understand the EPDs, to learn how to read them, to be able to extract the right figure, to compare with the requirement and so on. So it's a service for the project leaders, but it's also a way for us to be able to, on a more strategic level, know what is happening in the market. We use this data for updating the requirement levels and our default values in the LCA models as well. And just to give you an example on what it could look like, so when it comes to these climate requirements on material, cement and concrete are quite important material for us. And it also stands for a large proportion of the greenhouse gas emissions. We have now received more than 20 EPDs for different for concrete from different suppliers, and it's increasing every month. We get more EPDs. So this has been up and running now for 2 years, and we see an increasing amounts of EPDs every year. The requirements that is set on cement and concrete, it's actually there is a limit. So we ask for example, for cement that has emissions on less than 0.7 kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent. I see that I miss a kilogram there, but never mind. And this is for contracts that ends 2020 to 2024, and then the limits are a little bit sharper when it comes to contracts that ends 25 to 29. So this way we use stepwise sharpening of our requirements, and we are also quite transparent about it, so that the supplier can adjust to this if they know what is to be expected even in the future. I will also say that these requirements are under revision right now, so don't take it to don't write down these figures now because they will be revised. They will be more differentiated. This is the first set of requirements that we had. So we know that there are different types of concrete, and we need to differentiate those requirements a little bit. And we also want to add requirements on prefab concrete products. And how do we set these requirement levels? Well, one very important part is to have a dialogue with the industry. And then we need to understand the climate-related aspects of the manufacturing processes, and what process changes that are planned, and what the suppliers think about incentive models, what works in this regarding this material. Then we also do reviews of existing EPDs, and if there are not so many existing EPDs for that type of material, we use other type of LCA data. And then we set climate requirement levels, an incentive model based on estimation of the reasonable levels in the market today and in the future. And we do a lot of communication, both internally and externally. We could probably do more. We think this is a very important part to be successful. We really need to communicate. When I talk about incentive models, I didn't say that before, but we have a bonus system. So if the contractor or the material supplier delivers better than the threshold value, they can get a bonus. And if they fail to reach the target or the threshold value, there is a penalty fee. We have done some evaluations of our climate requirements. This is an early one. We did qualitative evaluations with interviews with the contractors and suppliers and consultants. And then we got these results that the Swedish Transport Administration climate requirements are interpreted as a forceful signal of the importance of the climate issue to the industry. And it was also found that participation process and dialogue was necessary for the requirements to be successfully implemented. That's why I said that communication is so important to both to have the right target values, but also to get the supplier to really strive to reach those goals. And it was also anticipated that the requirements will further contribute to the contractor's future financial or competitive benefits. So there were a lot of companies out there thinking that they would really gain from our requirements. And this is how it turned out in figures when we look at the technically approved material that we purchase ourselves. So these are, here you can see some of the technically approved material that we have purchased over the last 2 years. And you can see in the lower part, concrete sleepers and the 2 types of concrete sleepers. And then we have actually achieved a quite good improvement compared to our initial target value, to our baseline. So it is between like 17 and 21% emission reduction that have been achieved. And this was like for the material that we purchase. And if we look at the larger project for which we ask for the target value is set in the LCA model for the whole project, we do not tell the contractor how to receive the reduction, but we tell them that this reduction is to be achieved, and this is to make room for innovations. And if we look at those projects, these are some results that we can see. We have asked for 18% reduction in average in those projects. These are the red bars, and they differ because the projects are quite different. So in some projects, we cannot ask for too much of a reduction, while in other projects, we see a larger potential, and then we ask for a larger reduction. And the green bars here, they show what have been achieved. And as you can see, in some projects, the requirements are exceeded quite a lot. In the largest one, we got reduction of 40%, but we only asked for 17% reduction. So they got a big bonus then. But in some projects, they failed to achieve the targets. But on an average, we achieved 23% reduction. So it's a little bit better than what we asked for, actually. But I will also say that when I show this picture, that this is not the whole truth, because some projects that should have had requirements, they failed to even ask for climate reductions. So we are still on our way to implement this in a good way for the whole Swedish Transport Administration. These are just showing, these bars are just showing the projects that actually implemented the climate requirements. It should be implemented for all projects, but we are not really 100% there yet. So what are the challenges that I can see? I just listed some of them, and the first one I already told you about, the overlap with national and international policies and regulations, and how to argue for us to use the climate requirements in public procurements. Then there is, of course, a challenge that several stakeholders are involved, and we need to communicate a lot. It takes time, but it's important. It's also quite difficult to quantify the effect of the procurement requirements. It has to do with this overlap with the national and international policies and regulations. It's really difficult to say that this is a quantified effect of exactly our procurement requirements. That is very difficult to claim. Then we have also the questions regarding the costs in the different projects that needs to be managed. We need to have a balance between progressive requirements and the possibility to deliver, because we cannot face a situation where we are not able to do winter maintenance because we had too high climate requirements on the salt to be used, for example, or the sand or the fuel. That's a trick question to land on the right target. There is no guideline yet on how to manage the negative emissions that we see potential in, like, for example, biogenic binder in asphalt. There are other examples as well, like biocarbon that could be used in noise barriers, for example. And then, last but not least, climate is not the only important aspect to be considered, of course. Now, I talked about climate requirements, but we always see them as a part of a set of different aspects to be considered in the procurement. So that's for now, but you can read some more if you want to.
Thank you, Susanna. Any questions to Susanna? Yeah, let's see. Fiona first.
Thank you, Susanna. Two questions I would have. One was you mentioned that the requirements for cement and concrete, the performance requirements, will be updated soon. I was wondering if you knew what the sort of anticipated timeline for that was. And secondly,
during the year, during this
during
year.
the year, okay.
Yeah, and then, but it's quite a long process to get everything like decided and into our documents and so on. So probably it will, hopefully it will be like we will land in some values during this year. It will be decided, like for example in November. Then it can be implemented like in February next year. So it's a little bit ahead of us.
Understood. Okay, yeah. And then the second question I had was regarding the reporting requirement through EPDs. Do you have any sort of exceptions in place for projects that are typically very small or delivered by small businesses, for example, to ease that requirement?
Yes, I didn't say that, but good that you asked that, because we have like two alternatives, alternative verificates. That is also okay beside the EPDs. And this first one is like the verificate that is delivered through a pre-verified EPD tool. So I know that Svensk Betong, for example, has a tool in Sweden delivering EPDs, but they can also deliver so-called daughter EPDs that have not been third-party verified documents, but we still judge them as okay verificates. Then there is another possibility, and that is if you have EPDs counting up to more than 90% of the climate performance of the material, it will be okay to calculate the rest 10% in a simplified way. So you have to have EPDs verifying the larger part of the emissions, but not 100%.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting.
Peter?
Yes, thank you, Susanna, for interesting and impressive work you do in your procurement. My name is Peter Norstedt. I work for IDDI STPB. It's a Swedish central purchasing body. I have a question regarding procurement. Is always about a practical dimension and the problem to get the same sort of verification from suppliers and contractors. How do you equally treat? Do you see a problem with the big difference on documentation you get from different suppliers or bidders, because you have to equally treat them? Otherwise, at least we end up in court all the time when we don't equally treat all the tenders. Do you see a problem with that? And can you have the same ambition when you procure different infrastructure projects around in Sweden geographically? Do you have the same circumstances in the northern part of Sweden or other parts, because you can't transport heavy material like concrete around in the country? I guess that will also have a climate impact, of course.
Yeah, when you saw these bars, they were quite different, and that depends on like the circumstances for the project. It could be like geographical, but it could also be if it's a railway project or a road project. So different project has different possibilities to reach climate targets, and that is accounted for when we set the target values for the larger projects. So definitely. Regarding this being fair, yes, I think it's quite fair because it's transparent. So everybody knows the calculation rules because we ask for EN 15804, this standard, to be followed. That makes it like, yeah, it's fair. But of course, these standards are interpreted a little bit different by different program operators. And we have some discussions on how to handle it. So far, we have said that we do not put any extra requirements on the EPDs other than the program operators do. But one such problem is, for example, the mass balance approach and how that is interpreted by the program operators. So that is where we have seen some problems, but we have a discussion then with the suppliers. But then you said that there is a risk to end up in court. We haven't done that. We haven't faced that type of problem. I think it might be because we use these procurement requirements as a contract clause. So we do not have them as evaluation criteria. It's not so that we compare to EPDs in the procurement, but there are pros and cons with this, of course. So we procure mainly on price, and then the one who wins the bids knows from the beginning that supplier has to deliver something that reaches our target value. That could be a problem sometimes when we have a supplier that have a material that is very much better than the others, but a bit more expensive. Then we cannot do anything. So that the negative part of that. But the positive part is that it works, and it has been working so far. And we can see that the contractors, they are aware of our target values when they do their bids, and they can calculate on it. They can calculate on the bonus. They can tell us that, okay, we can reach these target values. We could even reach further. Sometimes we are told that from the suppliers that we can do a lot more. If you increase the bonus limits, we will do more because we could. We just need to know that we get the bonus for it. We have these kind of discussion with the suppliers before we set the targets. I hope that was an answer to your question.
I think I realize Trafikverket's road association, or not road, it's a what do you call it in English?
The transport administration.
Transport administration.
Yes.
You have a lot of resources to personal resources during the contract management period. If you are a small local authority or a smaller authority, you wouldn't be able to take to deal with this in this way because you don't have the personal resources to match the contract clauses you have written, because then you have to have a really tight discussion with the suppliers, contractors during the contract period, and to really ask for all the documents. Otherwise, it will end up in contract clauses that will not be followed up in the end, and that will send a signal to the market that would not be very good. So I think to use your experience in a smaller entity like a municipality, that could be quite dangerous, because I know that they don't have the resources or the competence to deal with this kind of criteria, because it takes a lot of resources and competence.
I think that a good first step could be to ask for the EPDs, because what we have heard from our suppliers is that just by asking for the EPDs, they are they get incentives to work in their organization. So, well, it helps the organization to learn about their processes and what are the hotspots and how can greenhouse gas emissions be reduced. So we have heard that from our suppliers, that they appreciate us. They appreciate even when we only ask for EPDs, not any target values, because it helps them a lot in their internal environmental work. So that could be a first step. And then you only have to check in the end that you receive an EPD from the supplier. So that could be a good starting point if you lack the resources. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. We do have the same experience from using EPDs or asking for EPDs in our contracts. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I have a question as well. So 2 weeks ago, we had a similar webinar on the topic of EPD and project environmental footprints. And my question to you, Susanna, is that something you're looking into, what that would mean if the EU goes for?
Yeah, we follow the CPR. Yeah, we follow it carefully, what's happening there. And we are a little bit worried that PEF will be used instead of EPDs, because then we have to change a lot in our procedures. We won't stop it. It's of course we could work with PEFs instead, but now we have like over 12,000 EPDs on the market for building products. There are new PEFs out there, so we couldn't use PEFs. We started this work with the EPDs that were there. We started this like 5, 6, 7 years ago, and we couldn't wait. Even then, we got that question like, shouldn't you wait for the CPR to be decided and the PEFs to be developed? And we were like, no, we can't wait. We can't wait for that. But if we have to change our procedures to work with ask for PEFs instead, I think that the whole climate work with our suppliers and our contractors will be delayed. So it will be 1 or 2 years delayed. The contractors will face some extra costs because they have to convert to PEFs instead of EPDs, and we will also face some extra costs, and it will take time to handle. But it is doable, but it's complicated. Yeah.
Federica.
Yes, just like speaking about what you just mentioned, what do you think about the new system that is being developed out of the CPR on GPP? Because I understand, and that's something I didn't know, it's quite different from what you are implementing at the moment. I mean, it will depend where kind of the threshold values are placed. So what do you think with regards to that? And is it something that you see positively, or it's something that you would prefer not seeing implemented?
It's difficult for me to answer because I maybe do not see the full implications of it. But when we talk about like aggregated values, that's not what we are interested in. We do not need the aggregated values. We do not want it because it's less transparent. It's more difficult to communicate with our suppliers. Yeah, we do not see it as very useful, to be honest. If you want, we could have some. So we could, apart from this seminar, we could have some discussion. If you would like to, you could contact me so we can have some.
Yeah, that's great.
Discussion about that. If you want to get a better answer, because I don't dare to say too much about it. It might be useful, but yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much. So Jens Johansson.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to share my screen somehow. Please let me know when you see the screen.
We see it.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to share some experiences from making requirements, and I'm from the National Public Procurement Agency, and we develop and convey knowledge, tools, and methods for purchasing and procurement in the public sector. And among other things, to promote sustainability, like the requirements. And this is, of course, to local, regional, and national authorities and municipalities, etc. And also we have other tasks. The requirements that we make, and you can find them on our web, mainly in Swedish, and they are free to use and to download. They are not mandatory to use. They are a voluntary tool for any procurer to use. And they should use it to express their preferences in this in the deal or the procurement. And we also make them almost every time to express higher ambitions than the level of the law express. And in legal technical terms, they are expressed as every requirement is expressed either as a selection criteria, a technical requirement, a specific requirement for contract performance, or a contract award criteria. And they, of course, we make them, of course, to comply with the EU law basic principles and other public procurement regulations. So they are to be non-discriminatory, to secure equal treatment of tenderers, proportionality and transparency, etc. And the requirements we make are not only the requirement text, but also a comprehensive support, like a text of containing arguments. Why should you use this requirement, this specific requirement? And then a text on the requirement itself, ready to use, copy-paste, and a short guiding text, because you can't use them. You have to assess if it's usable or appropriate to use in your procurement, of course. And then we also have text on how to prove compliance in the tenderers if you have requirements that are to be fulfilled already in the tenders. And of course, we also have to have information on how to follow up the requirements and how to validate compliance during the contract. And that's a very important bit and takes a lot of work, of course. Some experiences. This slide shows some common experience from working on requirements in public procurement, so they are not specific for only climate requirements. And one of the experience is that other actors also working on requirements may lack insight or knowledge of public procurement or of the rules and law regulations. So you can draw different conclusions in what is feasible, and that may lead to that we may recommend or choose other strategies for criteria, or we may express the criteria more thoroughly to make it able to hold up in court, which in turn take a lot more time and effort, and all that follows of that. And the second point is that it's often easier said than done to set up requirements if you expect the requirements to be able to be efficient, to secure compliance, and to make it able to follow them up and to validate them. And it's also the third point there, to express the requirements. It's a challenge to express, to write the requirements in text so that we have many target groups for the text. The buyer needs to understand it, the supplier needs to understand what is said, and their respectively technical experts need to, or consultants needs to understand what the texts say, and also legal experts with their special language needs to, and terms, needs also to understand what the requirements say, and to embody that in one single mass of text is a rather challenging task. some experiences from working on climate requirements. Well, we made some climate requirements, and in this process we had quite a lot of people saying that they wanted contract award criteria because that would be most efficient. But we ended up actually don't recommend this because all the previous mentioned challenges. So and we also was in a situation when making requirements for building houses that we wanted to set a target limit of climate impact. This is the maximum climate impact in tons of CO2 equivalents you must not pass when you build this house in your project, but that was not feasible at the moment. So we ended up having to make requirements in form of percent reduction of climate impact, which was very hard to set down in text, because then you have to define a baseline to calculate the reduction from. You need to think not only to include the reductions, but also to include eventual increased climate impacts in the calculations. Otherwise, you miss out. You won't describe what is actually happening. And you also need to ensure that the requirement leads to real reductions and not just are achievable by improving your calculations. And all this has to be transparent, which was quite a challenge. So finding more or less a standard, and you need to find more or less a standardized set of technical terms for calculating the climate impact or climate impact calculations. And we were lucky that the IVL already had this going, and I should add in this on this slide, I should add that we draw a lot of learnings and experiences from Trafikverket and Susanna and her colleagues, of course, and we are very, very grateful for their work, and also of the work of IVL that we leaned on very heavily. So other challenges is to find common history boundaries within this standard set of technical terms for climate impact calculations. And for example, our colleagues in the House Planning and Housing Authority, in Sweden we have a legal requirement to set up a climate impact declaration of new houses, and this was constructed within the Planning and Housing Authority, and they chose a slightly big different system boundaries for calculating this than the rest of the actors, including us. So we had to figure out how it should work together, and what was also a challenge. And these slight different, when people shows different system boundaries, it's a challenge to make it work together still, even though it's within the same set of technical terms for calculating climate impact. And we also have the challenge that in public life, some stakeholders have very progressive statements and goals, but when you actually start to make it concrete, they walk back from their statements, or they don't stand up to it to be used in this or that way, so you can't rely on some stakeholder statements to make requirements that you actually thought was possible, which is also quite a challenge. And then we have the challenges and risks rather for green procurement by greenwash taken out of context, so to speak, and especially procurement of concrete and building. This very many examples of procurement comes late in the planning, building, or construction processes. So when reducing climate impact in the procurements of materials and modus operandi, this may not compensate for previous actions in the planning, building, or construction process. For instance, in early stages, what carbon sinks are extinguished in the planning process, biogenic, and that i.e. forests or wetlands, etc. And what carbon deposits, both biogenic and abiotic, are being released into the atmosphere. And when it comes to housing, but perhaps also in road construction work, is renovation preferable instead of tearing down and building all new? So when you use procurement as a tool, it's very important on the strategic level to think of the whole context in which you used procurement. So you can't, because in the end we need to reduce the climate impact. So and in that context, the whole planning, building, and construction process must be considered on the strategic level to achieve this. And when thinking in more strategic processes for purchasing, and planning and building, what are the strategic alternatives? You have to address these strategic alternatives before you say you do green procurement. Otherwise, you may miss out the larger impact of your actions. Some other challenging things is when producing support and tools, and that is to make the legal expert in public procurements understand the context and the urgency of addressing the climate crisis. And this may sound a bit strange, but for bodies like the National Procurement Agency that make tools, this is a challenge because we also have to be somehow teaching our legal experts meanwhile to understand this and why it's important and etc. And then, as Susanna also mentioned, and you, Peter, also mentioned, a bit of a challenge is the lack of data. And a rather big challenge is the question of the data quality and the specific data in EPDs. So we have general data in EPDs and you have specific data in EPDs. And this question is to be addressed, has to be addressed in the future. And we also have the large challenge of biogenic carbon and land use change, as previously mentioned. But in the context of EPDs, to include biogenic carbon in EPDs, a rather big challenge in this context is that when you use material for building. You can use steel, for instance, concrete, and the alternative might be wood, and that is also often calculated as nearly net zero, where the only climate impact is from the machinery logging. But we know from scientific research that that is not quite true, because you don't take into account the biogenic release of carbon into the atmosphere when you log from the ground, and etc., etc. So there are also different kinds of forestry regimes that have a huge impact on how much biogenic carbon is released into the atmosphere when doing this. And in Sweden, this is specifically a sensitive topic due to the forest and pulp industry, and thus also a very politically sensitive question and hard to work with, which is due to that a rather big challenge also when it comes to getting these calculations into the EPDs. And also, as Susanna mentioned, an upcoming challenge is the EU work on the PEF via the established EPD systems. And this EPD set of challenges are a challenge for public procurement, because the EPDs, of course, are very good to use for verifications and follow-ups. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So Stefan, I'm sorry, bad planning from my side. I think we have to wrap up. Do you have some final comment? I shared work Stefan has done together with colleagues, which is worth reading. But maybe I can ask you for
just a final comment here. I just want to lift what we are doing together with procurement, with Jens and the others on the procurement agency. We are trying to develop criteria for concrete. And as you see on the screen here, it's quite complicated. In the future, when we have carbon neutral cement that has the same specifications that you can use in the same way as Portland cement, it won't be a problem to procure carbon neutral cement or concrete. But until then, when things are different in how they work, how the concrete works, and when you build with it, you have to assess a lot of things. So it's complicated. This is just a very schematic view of the criteria model that we're working with to include both resource efficient design, deciding to use the right concrete in the right place, and then finally finding requirements for getting low carbon concrete when you are producing. But you have to take into account production time, you have to take into account investigation time and organization, competence, and things like that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry about that, Stefan, but very interesting presentation and discussion, and I will share the recording, and also if all the speakers can share their slides, if that's all right, I will include that also in the documentation. But yeah, thank you everyone for excellent overview, global, EU level, and also the Swedish context. So let's stay in touch.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.